So, this is something that happened to me about 2 years ago at my friend's house. She lived right across a fairly busy 2-lane road from the parking lot on our college campus. I say this because the tall lights in the parking lot come into play later. The house has a bay window in the front of it that spans across almost the entire front side. In front of this window is a small porch without railings and a 2-person porch swing. Inside the window is the living room that has a huge sectional couch. And covering the front window is a thin purple tapestry. You can see silhouettes through it, but can't make out any features. Her front yard is about 20 feet long, with tall bushes lining the sidewalk, and the side of her property has 5 tiny evergreen-looking trees that are roughly about 6 feet tall. Now that you have a makeshift diagram, let me explain my encounter with whatever it was. The other 5 people in the house were asleep, and it was about 3:30 in the morning. I went outside to smoke a cigarette because I couldn't sleep. I'm sitting on the front swing and I hear rustling. I figured it was literally any type of animal and ignored it. But then I heard what sounded like something on 2 legs shuffle through the leaves on the sidewalk at a very fast pace. You can recreate the sound by doing a fast shuffle without lifting your feet off the ground. Now I'm alert. I think I even said, "What the hell?" out loud. So I stand up, still smoking my cigarette, look over at the right side of the property with the tiny evergreen-esque bushes. The sound trailed from the left to the right of the property. Now, like I said, the parking lot is across the street. The tall lights are on at all hours, so it illuminates from behind, leaving me to only see silhouettes. I see something that may have been about 4 feet tall. It looked like it would have been a little shorter than my chest height, and I am 5'4". It was peeking out at me, like it was curious. But I also felt like it was malicious, because I got this overwhelming sense of dread and fear. We stared at each other for what felt like 3 solid minutes. I felt like I was in a trance. The best way to describe the thing I saw would be like it was proportioned but malnourished. Someone once suggested that it might be a midget. I apologize if that term is not PC, but I know for a fact it was not. This thing was very thin and perfectly proportioned, like a thin and sickly child. I guess it kinda looked like that little guy from Lord of the Rings movies. You know, Gollum? I looked down at my cigarette for no more than a second. When I looked back up, it was gone. I heard movement, and I said, "Screw this," and ran inside, locking the door behind me. Then, sitting on the couch, I was staring at the window when I suddenly saw something run across, blocking a portion of the light from the parking lot as it went by. For it to do this, it had to have been on the porch where I just was. So that's basically my experience. I would love some insight on what you guys think. And just in case anyone believes it's an animal, the area was in South New Jersey, fairly rural and about 10 minutes away from the Pine Barrens. No, I don't think this is a Jersey Devil. I'm just giving geographic information. Thank you. I've recently decided to move from my sister's home, and I was telling my older brother about a few sightings me and my sisters have been having over the last year or so. These were on multiple occasions and at random times of the morning and night. He told me to look it up online since he's crazy into supernatural things, and he told me it might be a Dogman. I don't know what that is exactly, but these posts I've seen here are more accurately describing the creature we've been seeing, and I decided to tell about my own similar experiences. The first time I saw it, I was looking out the front door. I always check outside before I take the dogs out because we live in a kind of town home community, and people have all types of vicious dogs not on leashes, and I never want to have an encounter with any of those dogs. Our front door is all frosted, except the center, which is the only part you can see out of, and it's shaped like a rose. I took a look outside and caught a sight of a doggish-shaped kind of creature. But without my glasses on, I just thought it was a dog. And to be sure of this, I put my glasses on and cracked the door just to get a better look. The only way I can describe this creature to anyone is that it was very spiny and it was hunched on all fours. It looked exactly like a human pretending to be a dog from behind. Like it walked kind of funny on its legs. I slammed the door and turned around to yell for my sister's attention so she could also see what I was seeing. But when I looked back outside, it was gone, vanished, like it was never even there. And this area is heavily wooded across from our townhouse, so I figured maybe it was a dog, and I was just super sleepy and hallucinated everything about it. This is Georgia. I've lived here my whole life, and the weirdest thing I've ever seen was a drunk man trying to ride a dog like a horse. I talked to my eldest sister the next day about it, and her reaction was, "Yeah, what the heck was that thing? I've been seeing it a few times when I pull in from work. The other night, my headlights flashed on it and it ran into the woods." She later called it a creepy white dog, but admitted that she'll sit and wait in the car for a bit before coming in, just to make sure it's gone. She even called me once and asked me to unlock the door so she can make a run for it. Some of our relatives has said that it's just a dog and we shouldn't worry about it. Now, you guys don't have to do this, but if you were to get down on all fours, raise your back just a little bit and walk across the floor just like that. That's what it was doing when I saw it. Every step it took looked, well, like a human pretending to be a dog. We've never seen its face though, and I'm a little scared to wonder what it actually looks like. So, my first sighting story is actually an old friend of mine's who I haven't seen or spoken to in years, but I still remember this very vividly to this day. It must have been about 96, and I had just turned 22. I was at a party with a few friends, and the host of the party was a daughter of some wealthy family. She was a bit of a spoiled girl from what I can remember, and her parents had this really amazing house, which I remember having this pretty awesome chandelier at the entrance of one of the highest ceilings I have ever seen. Anyway, the house itself was in solitude and was the only house around for some distance. To get to it, you had to drive a minute or two along this really long road that wasn't lit up at all. The house was surrounded by a lot of forest, but had a small lake nearby. Now, the part had been going on for a good few hours, and a buddy of mine was showing up pretty late because of working late or something. I have no idea why, because it was years ago, but I know he showed up fairly late. I remember being in the kitchen, talking to someone, and in he comes, bursting into the room, fully out of breath, and immediately comes to me and interrupts my conversation. He was extremely hysterical, and I remember telling him to calm down and to breathe. He then began to say that his dad dropped him off on the start of where the longest road began, and his dad was in a hurry. I remember thinking why the hell his dad would let him walk across a dark forest road to a secluded house at night on his own, but was sensible too. But hey, who am I to judge someone else's family? My friend was saying he was walking up the road, about halfway, drinking his cans when he heard a sort of growl from behind him. Thinking he was about to get attacked by a wolf or whatever, he began to walk at a much faster pace. And it wasn't until he turned around, and about 10 feet from him, at a tree, was this hunched over white creature. I remember him constantly calling it this tall, white thing. He said it had a huge head and a gaping mouth. He let out a scream, and then ran as quick as he could to the house. He made it to the house and busted in without looking back, which he then immediately found me. Now at the time, and for years after, I personally just thought he saw an animal, and his imagination went wild. I think people for years would just go, "Yeah, dude, whatever," when he would bring it up. But he never let anyone get to his head, and he was always so defensive over what he saw. Now to my story, and why I now firmly believe my friend. I was camping with my wife and daughter in Minnesota last year at the beginning of July. For summer, the campsite we were at was pretty quiet, but there were a few families near our tents. It's next to a river and is covered by thick forest. Now the opening of our tent faced north towards the river. It was truly an awesome view coming out of your tent. It was close to sunset, but still fairly lit enough just to see across the river clearly. I remember specifically saying to my wife that I needed the lighter to start the stove to boil some water for dinner. Now, I remember setting up the stove, and as I looked up to get a glimpse of the river, something caught my eye. There was this thing walking through the forest on the other side of the river. It was incredibly tall, and its limbs were so skinny. It didn't seem to look in my direction until someone from another family at our campsite shouted. Not about the thing across the river, just about something else. That shout made it look over in my direction, and I still remember its pale, bulbous head looking straight at me across the river. It then haunched over on all fours and began to crawl away at an incredible speed into the opposite direction. I didn't sleep at all that night. I didn't tell my wife or daughter because I didn't want to terrify my little girl, because I know it would have freaked her out. The next day, we were supposed to stay another night, but I did not let that happen. My wife asked why I let her know what I saw, and she knew I wasn't lying. Trust me, she would have known if I was. That creature still gives me creeps to this day. It's actually giving me a few sleepless nights, but finding out how many people have seen exactly what I have always helps a bit. I was reminded of something me and my friend both saw at night in a park in Montana well over 10 years ago. When I remembered it, I got intense shivers down my spine because I had completely forgotten all about it. We were about 14 or 15, walking through our local park and probably shouldn't have been out as late as we were, 12 to 1 a.m.-ish. We were walking through the big soccer fields towards the playground that had just been built, and surrounding the playground and soccer fields were quite a few trees. We saw a really tall, skinny white thing on 2 legs that reminded me of some kind of humanoid rabbit, but without ears, and it was striding really elegantly and quickly from tree to tree. It seemed like it was hiding from us, and then it peeked out from behind a tree. I remember thinking it was a deer at first glance because of its long legs, and then I saw it was walking on 2 legs. We had crossed over half the soccer field, so it was pretty close, maybe 100 to 100 feet away. We both nearly lost our minds, but were frozen in place watching it. After a few moments of having a stare down with this thing, it ran away, bounding, and disappeared behind more trees. My buddy wanted to chase it, but I was too scared, so we left. The things I distinctly remember was it passed behind one of the soccer goals, and it was taller than it. It also moved so gracefully and smoothly, but fast. Anyway, thought you guys might like this, so here you go. So, I am from Alexandria, Kentucky, and I saw something last night that I couldn't entirely explain. Last night was Midnight Madness for our school. It's basically some stupid football event during the summer, but everyone goes to see people they haven't seen over summer. I went with my 2 friends and one of their girlfriends. We got there around 10:45. Me and my friends were getting pretty bored of the event, and my one friend had just bought dabs. For those who don't know what dabs are a very concentrated form of THC, often using butane, propane, CO2, or ethanol to purify and get the most THC possible from cannabis, so it's extremely potent. We got in my buddy's car and were looking for a place to smoke. We were driving around this subdivision that had very thick forests all around it. We settled on this abandoned house and decided to smoke in the woods behind it. My friend was setting up his rig, and we realized we had forgot the water for the dab rig. A dab rig is basically a bong, but for marijuana concentrate, and needs water or else it will be too harsh to smoke. Well, we had parked a little bit down the street, so no one would be suspicious of our activities. Nobody wanted to go back to the car because it was a 5-minute walk, so I decided to go back for the water. While I was walking back, I heard scratching from behind a nearby house. It kind of freaked me out, but I thought it just must have been a dog or some animal. I made it to the car and got the water and started heading back. As I was walking back by the house, I heard the scratching again. I began to hear it again, but then I heard what sounded like a footstep kicking up gravel when someone starts trying to run. I turn and see something that has kept me up all night. Now, I want you to keep in mind that I'm a 6'2", 17-year-old guy, so I'm bigger than most things. And this thing that I saw had me easily beat in height by well over 2 feet. It was slender, but with long, almost outstretched limbs. I couldn't really make out any more details, just due to the poor lighting. This thing or creature was running from one backyard to another. I never saw its face, only body. It ran on 2 feet, but it was faster than any person I have ever seen run. Hell, it was faster than anything I've ever seen run. The creature made it back from one backyard to the next, about 50 to 90 feet, in only a few seconds. I was standing in the middle of the street, about 30 feet away. I stood there for a second in complete shock. Then I ran as fast as I could to my friends. I ran through thorns and bushes to make it back to them. I ran and told them what I saw, and I'm not too sure if they believed me. But the panic in my voice was enough for them to know I had saw something. We all packed up our rig and went back to the car. I have been up all night trying to find out what I saw. The 2 closest things I have seen on the internet is something called the Dover Demon and something called the Wood Devil. I never saw its face, so I'm not too sure what it was. If anyone could help me explain what I saw, or has had a similar experience, please let me know. And please also know that I was 100% sober at the time of seeing this creature. I grew up in rural Missouri. My family moved there in 1985 when I was 4. About 15-20 minutes from the closest town, with the closest town being Wright City, about 15 minutes north. It was really in the middle of nowhere. You had to drive a mile or 2 down one gravel road, and before you got to the gravel road I lived down, that was about 1.5 miles long that only my family and our neighbor lived on. There was about 3,000 to 4,000 acres north of us that no one lived on, and about 1,000 acres south of us that no one lived on. It was all owned by the same guy who only came out during deer season to hunt the property south of us and lived in a town about 20 miles west. The land north of us was mostly incredibly hilly forest, with a few caves about a mile north of a house. The land south of us was about 50-50 woods to fields, with an old 100-year-old abandoned cabin deep into the woods. The property owner had told us that no one had lived there since the late 1800s. I had a few sightings while growing up there. I'd always told myself it was the Momo, the Missouri monster, Missouri's version of Bigfoot, and wasn't until I saw a trail cam photo of what was said to be a forest ghoul several years later. This led me to do a little more research, which I'll mention later. First memorable sighting was back when I was just a teenager. Me, my brother, sister, and dad were playing a game I learned in Boy Scouts called Manhunt that was basically a blend of hide and seek and tag. We'd set a boundary around a cedar thicket just north of the house. Me and my little brother were on a team against my dad and sister. Me and my brother hid first, with my dad and sister eventually catching us. We then let my dad and sister hide and went to go find them. We ended up catching my sister, but couldn't find my dad, so we started working together. The cedars were thick and the sun was setting. We were probably in the last 10 minutes of daylight for the day. We want to catch our dad fast before we couldn't see anymore. We searched most of the area and didn't find him. Eventually, I spotted what looked like 2 feet, about 30 feet in front of us. They were barefoot and pale. Not thinking much of it, I told my brother I thought Dad had taken his shoes off, just to be more stealthy. We spread out about 20 feet apart and tried to sneak up on him from opposite sides, crouching the whole way so we could see under the cedar trees, but we couldn't see through the thicket. We got about 15 feet away before it realized we were coming up on it, and it took off. We both took off running after it thinking it was my dad. We chased it to the edge of the thicket where there was a small open glade before the start of the large forest that spread back into the hills. We yelled that he was running out of the bounds as we got to the edge of the thicket, and we noticed what appeared to be a pale, naked man jetting into the woods. This spooked the hell out of my brother and me, but we still wanted to believe it was just my dad playing with us. So we ran the opposite direction, back south towards the house, only to see my dad sitting next to my sister by a pond, easily 100 yards across the field from the thicket. We asked my dad how he got over there so fast, and him and my sister told us he'd been sitting there with her for 20 minutes now, waiting for us to figure out that he wasn't in the woods. My brother and me tried to explain what we saw to him, but he blew it off, saying that it was probably just a deer. Meanwhile, we had chickens multiple times as I was growing up. Normally, they'd be fine in the chicken coop for just a few months, but then something would start killing them, tearing open the wire fencing to the caged yard. Usually, we'd find 1 or 2 chickens just torn up, laying there in the yard. My mom and dad always said it was wild dogs, but the chickens never looked eaten, just slaughtered. He'd always repaired the fencing, yet it kept happening. Usually once it started, most of our chickens would be dead and gone within a week or 2. My mom would be upset since she's the one that wanted to have chickens, and would normally give up on them until next spring, when she'd get a couple dozen more. Sometimes she'd skip a year, but I can think of at least 4 to 5 occasions of getting batches of chickens, and them all dying. Eventually, she gave up and took a few years off from trying to raise chickens. My senior year of high school, she decided to try having chickens again. It was good at first, and then a couple of months later, they started getting killed again. This time though, it was peeling off the wire roof of the caged yard. The cage was about 5 to 6 feet tall. My dad said it was dogs, but the opening would normally be a few feet off the ground. I remember questioning my dad at that point, saying if it was dogs, wouldn't they be trying to dig under the fence, not going from the top? The slaughtering seemed to be worse than before, with dead chickens being tossed all over the yard. Yet just torn up, never eaten, no bites taken out of them, nothing. My sister had gotten a pygmy goat the year before to raise for FFA. One day, we found it dead and mutilated as well. It was in a stable yard on the side of our barn, with a 6 to 7 foot tall fence around it. Yet something had still gotten to it. Parents still claimed it was dogs. Then, one night my sister's boyfriend was having a bonfire party, and I went over there with my sister, because my parents wouldn't let her go to a party without me going with her, just to watch over her. My sister got really drunk, but I didn't drink much because I was too busy watching over her. I think I had maybe half a beer all night. We left late that night, maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. When I got home, I would park my truck in the yard next to the driveway, usually facing the chicken coop. I pulled in and my sister just started screaming and pointing forward. I looked up and saw what at the time I could best describe as something that looked like Gollum from the Lord of the Rings on the roof of the chicken coop. It was staring right at us, crouched down, just like Gollum normally was in the movies. It was pale white, and it had a very, very thin layer of hair on the top of its head, probably less than Gollum had in the movies, and it had 2 red eyes that glowed in the headlights. It appeared to be hissing at us. I locked the doors and quieted my sister down, then started honking the horn and flashing between my brights and regular headlights. Me and my sister were both freaking out. It jumped off the back of the chicken coop towards the direction of the woods north of the house, and I lost sight of it. My parents had turned on the outside lights at that point and were looking out the door. I grabbed my sister and ran as fast as I could inside with her. When we tried to tell my parents what we saw, they of course refused to believe us, told us we were just drunk and full of shit. I tried to tell them I wasn't drunk, but they wouldn't believe me. Sadly, my sister was so intoxicated, she didn't even remember coming home the next day. A few nights later, we were all gathering up in the living room to watch a movie we had rented from the video store. As we were watching the previews, we heard the chickens screeching. My dad was still convinced it was dogs and had a loaded .30-30 rifle by the back door, ready for when they showed up again. He ran and grabbed his rifle and a spotlight, also near the door, and ran out back. Few moments after he went outside, we heard a gunshot, followed by continuously firing until he had emptied the whole clip. This was very unlike him. Growing up, he taught me and my brother that a good hunter only takes 1 shot at something. If you need 2 or more, you're not a good enough shot. He even made us get our first kill with single-load muzzle-loaded black powder rifles before we could use a regular rifle with a magazine. Never in my entire life had I seen or heard my dad unload a full clip at something. He charged back in and immediately told us kids to go lock all the doors and windows to the house. He was white as a ghost. Meanwhile, he said he needed to talk to my mom. He took my mom into the back room and closed the door, where they went and talked for a good 20 minutes. I already knew what it was. I was already scared before he even went outside. Me and my brother and sister waited in the living room until they got done talking. I asked him what he saw, and he told me he didn't want to talk about it and not to bring it up again. The next day, him and my mom decided to slaughter all the chickens, and they wouldn't be getting any more. To this day, my dad still won't talk about what he saw, and nowadays acts like it never happened and plays stupid. I went off to college a couple months later, and I never saw it again after that. I'd sometimes tell people, though, they're my Momo story, but never really thought much about it. That's pretty much it as far as sightings go. This next part is a little more weird stuff I learned about the area. A decade or so later, I was dating a girl who claimed she was sensitive, claimed she could feel and see things like ghosts, magic, and just having a third eye. I always found it cute and a little personality quirk of hers, and didn't really buy into it. Anyway, I hadn't told her that story yet, and we were out at my parents' house, sitting around a fire in my parents' backyard. She started acting weird. She turned and started looking north towards the woods, and asked me if I knew anything about the wilderness. She said she was getting a feeling that something really ancient and evil was in the woods back there. Asked me what I knew. Then started asking me what happened on the land. Told me that something horrible had happened. After hearing my story, she said she thought it could be a ghoul. I honestly had no idea what, but it was enough to get me to go digging. I immediately saw a picture online shortly after Googling about ghouls that was labeled a forest ghoul. It was the famous trail cam pic. I immediately lost it. Was like, that's it. That's what I saw back then. Read about how, although they like to kill stuff, they don't like fresh meat, and prefer stuff that's starting to rot. It totally made sense to me that why it would slaughter the chickens, only to come back for them later, after they had been lying around and rotting. I then started trying to research the area's history, just to find out more. Where you first turn off the paved road onto the first gravel road, there were foundations of old buildings in the woods. Walls and roofs gone, just the stone floors remained. One of the old men that lived nearby when I was growing up said that one of them used to be the old post office. Did some more digging and found out it was one of the old town Hickory Grove, once the county seat as well. I knew that was the name of the voting district, but I didn't know it was a town ever. It was established in the early 1800s, but after the Civil War, a group of rebels that had refused to surrender had come through and ransacked the town. They had gathered them all up in the church, and where they locked them up and burned them all alive. Turns out that church was about less than a quarter of a mile from where my parents' house was. And the decade or so that followed, what was left of the town had died out. The few residents that were left had moved away, claiming the town was cursed. Before 1900, the town had vanished. I also learned around 1920 that they had dug out the area where the church had burned down to collect all the remains they could find and properly bury them. There was now a large quarried pond where it once was. Not sure how relevant the information is to the sighting, but I always wondered if perhaps they were related. The land north of my parents' house has been getting developed over the last decade or so. There's a high-class gated rural community that brought it up, who just got a township a few years ago called Innsbruck. They've been clearing the land and building mansions and lakes back there. Lots of old CEOs and retired professional athletes live back in there. I've always wondered if that chased it off, or if it still lurks around at night.